Okay, I want you to picture a scenario, a really chaotic one.
Right.
You have this movement, it's growing fast. Thousands of people all over the northeastern United States. They're passionate, they're full of energy, and they have this message they think is going to change the world. But they have a huge problem.
Chaos.
Absolute chaos. I mean, they have no name, no headquarters, not even a bank account.
And the people actually doing the work, the preachers, they're often broke. They're literally working in cornfields just to survive because there's no payroll.
And here's the kicker. The members of this movement, they are terrified of getting organized.
It seems so counterintuitive, doesn't it? Usually when a group gets bigger, you want that structure.
Of course.
But these people, they believed that if they, wrote down a constitution or elected a president, they would become the very thing they hated.
It's the ultimate startup paradox. You have to organize to survive, but you think organizing is a sin. So welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're zeroing in on a really critical decade, 1853 to 1863. We're going to unpack Section 4 of the Church Heritage Document to understand how the Seventh-day Adventist Church actually became a church.
And this isn't just a history lesson, It's really a masterclass in crisis management. We're looking at how this scattered, almost Wild West group of believers had to overcome their own fears to build what is now a global institution.
Our mission today is to trace that transformation. I mean, how do you get from organization is evil to establishing a full general conference with a constitution in just 10 years?
Well, the short answer is it didn't happen overnight. It happened because reality just kept hitting them in the face.
Okay, so let's start with that first brick wall. The year is 1853. The source material calls this period the identity crisis. What exactly was going so wrong?
Well, try to put yourself in their shoes. Imagine you're a believer in, say, a small town in Ohio back in the 1850s.
Right. No internet, no website to check.
Exactly. You just have your little local group. Then one day, a man rides into town on a horse. He says he's an Advent preacher, that he has new light for the flock.
And you have no way of knowing if he's legit. There's no official list of pastors or anything?
Not a thing. He could be genuine or he could be a complete fraud. He could be teaching all sorts of strange, fanatical doctrines that have nothing to do with what the main group believes. And this was happening all the time.
It's a total reputation nightmare.
It is. Because if one guy goes into a town and acts crazy in the name of your movement, then the whole movement looks crazy.
So the informal leaders, the leading brethren as the source calls them, they realized they had to do something.
They did. They couldn't just let anyone claim to represent them. So in 1853, they came up with a very low-tech solution.
Identity cards.
Identity cards. It sounds so formal, so bureaucratic for a group that hated organization.
But it was a survival mechanism.
Totally. These little cards were signed by the recognized leaders, people like James White or Joseph Bates, and they basically certified that the person carrying it was a trusted teacher of valid doctrine.
It's like a verified user checkmark for the 19th century.
That's a perfect way to put it. It was really the forerunner to modern ministerial credentials. It was the first tiny step towards saying, okay, there is an us and there is a them. We have some boundaries.
So step 1 is security, stop the imposters. But step 2 is growth, right? You can't just protect what you have to expand. And that brings us to what I'd call the innovation phase, around 1853, 1854.
This is where you see a big shift in how they operated. Up until this point, if a preacher went on a trip, he basically just went on faith.
He'd pack a bag and hope someone would feed him at the next stop.
Yes, exactly. It sounds romantic, but you can't run a strategic campaign when your entire strategy is just hope I don't starve.
Not very effective.
So in the summer of 1853, the church in Battle Creek, Michigan, did something revolutionary. They sent out 2 men elders, Loughborough and Cornell, with a specific mission. And this is the crucial part, a travel budget.
Wow, they actually paid for their expenses.
They covered their travel costs for a tour through 3 states. Now, that might seem small to us, but it was a massive shift from volunteer hobbyist to sponsored missionary. Yeah. They were finally putting money behind the mission.
And the next year, 1854, they took an even bigger risk.
The tent.
The famous 600-foot circular tent. I saw the price tag in the notes, $200.
Mm-hmm.
In 1854, for a group with basically no income, that must have felt like a fortune.
It was a huge investment and a risky one. But think about the strategy change it represented. Before the tent, where did they meet?
In private homes, I guess. Barns.
Exactly. Private homes, barns, maybe a borrowed schoolhouse. It was all very insular.
And you can only fit, 20 people in a living room? You pitch a massive tent, you can fit hundreds.
And it's public. The first Seventh-day Adventist tent meeting was on June 10th, 1854. And it signaled they weren't just a private study group anymore, they were taking their message to the public square.
So the adults are getting organized with ID cards and tents.
Mm-hmm.
But the source material also points out another group they started to focus on in 1853.
Yes, the youth, the kids.
You can't have a long-term movement if you lose the next generation.
You really can't. And so in 1853, you see the first regular Sabbath schools pop up, specifically in Rochester and Bucksbridge, New York.
And this wasn't just babysitting. It was structured.
That's the key. It was driven by literature. A magazine called The Youth's Instructor had launched the year before, and it provided the actual lessons. So now you've got this parallel track, organized preaching for adults and organized teaching for the children.
You're building an ecosystem, but every ecosystem needs a center, right?
Yeah.
And by 1855, their center, Rochester, New York, was becoming a problem.
It was a geography problem. I mean, the U.S. was expanding westward, the frontier was moving.
And the believers were moving with it.
They were. And Rochester was just too far east. The source says it was becoming out of the way. They had to be where the growth was.
Which meant moving to the Midwest.
To Battle Creek, Michigan, specifically. Yes. But what I love is how they did it. James White, who was running the whole publishing operation, he didn't have a corporate relocation budget.
He couldn't just write a check.
No. So 4 laymen, just regular church members, stepped up. They offered him a $1,200 loan.
Wow.
Interest-free, to finance the entire move.
$1,200 in 1855. That's serious money. That's like the price of a nice house back then.
It absolutely was. And that grassroots funding allowed them to set up a new shop in Battle Creek. They built a small 2-story house to serve as the headquarters.
Okay, let's manage expectations here when we say headquarters. The source says the building was 20 by 30 feet.
It was tiny. A 2-car garage is bigger than that.
And basically a garage.
But that little building was the nerve center for the entire movement. The Review and Herald Press was established there. The editorial office was there. This is where Uriah Smith enters the picture. He was made editor, and get this, he'd only been a believer for 2 years.
That's a fast track to management.
Well, he was talented, and from that little 20 by 30 building, they pumped out the Review, the church paper, and the Youth's Instructor. It became the heartbeat of the church for decades, right up until the headquarters moved to Washington, D.C. in 1903.
So, okay, we have a headquarters, we have a press. But there's still a massive hole in this whole operation.
Money.
The perennial problem. You can't run a global mission on, sporadic donations.
The source is pretty blunt about the old way. Before the late 1850s, preachers got 0 salary. Nothing. They were self-supporting.
Which is just a nice way of saying they had to work another job.
Right. So you might have this amazing preacher, but if he has a family to feed, he has to stop preaching to go harvest wheat or build a house. It's so inefficient. You have your best talent working part-time.
Yeah. They needed a system. Which brings us to one of the most interesting terms in Adventist history, systematic benevolence.
It sounds so Victorian, doesn't it?
Yeah.
We shall now practice systematic benevolence.
It really does.
But the name tells you exactly what it was. It wasn't random charity, it was systematic. A group led by J. N. Andrews, they searched the Bible to find a better way.
And the plan they came up with in 1859 is fascinating. It wasn't the 10% tithe that we think of today.
No, the math was different. It was basically a property tax on yourself. The plan asked men to give annually at least 1% of all their personal property, free of debt.
1% of your assets. So if you owned a farm worth $1,000, you owed $10 a year.
Plus weekly free will offerings, but that 1% baseline was the game changer. It meant the leadership could actually look at the membership and forecast a budget.
Okay, we have this much property in the church, so we can expect roughly this much revenue.
Precisely. And they didn't stop there. They also started monetizing their content.
Right. Before 1853, they were giving all the tracts and papers away for free.
Which is a fantastic way to go broke. James White realized that printing costs money, so they started selling things. Loughborough set the price for a full set of tracts at 35 cents. The subscription for the Review was set at $1 a year.
And I saw a key phrase in the source about that subscription.
Payable in advance.
That's the most important part.
It really is. Payable in advance creates cash flow, it creates working capital. It meant they could buy paper and ink before they printed the magazine. This whole shift allowed them to finally pay ministers a salary. It professionalized the entire ministry.
Okay, so let's take stock. By 1860, they have security with ID cards, they have a headquarters in Battle Creek, and they have a financial model. Logic would say, okay, time to incorporate. Time to become a real organization.
Logic would say that. Emotion, on the other hand, said absolutely not.
This is the great debate. This is the core conflict that defines this entire decade. Why were they so resistant to just becoming a church?
You really have to understand their history. Most of these early believers had been kicked out of other churches.
Right. They were ex-Methodists, ex-Baptists.
Exactly. But when they accepted this Advent message, they were often disfellowshipped, they were burned by the system, they had religious trauma,
That's a good way to put it.
and they used a specific loaded word to describe organized religion: Babylon. In the Bible, Babylon represents confusion, oppression, a corrupt system. They believed the established churches had become Babylon.
So the fear was, if we organize, we become Babylon too.
That was the absolute core of the fear. There's this powerful quote in the source from a man named George Storrs. He said, "No church can be organized by man's invention, but what it becomes is Babylon the moment it is organized."
The moment it is organized. So the act itself is the sin, in his view.
Yes. The belief was that structure inevitably kills the spirit. So when leaders like James White started saying, hey, we need to legally organize, they were attacked. They were accused of going back to Babylon, of trying to create a union of church and state, even of being power hungry.
That's a tough room to work. You're just trying to keep the movement from falling apart, and people are calling you a tyrant.
A complete tyrant.
So how did the pro-organization side win the argument?
Necessity. Pure, simple necessity. The pragmatic view won out because you literally couldn't function without it. And the single biggest driver was property.
Legal ownership.
Right. Who owns the publishing house? Who owns that big tent? If it's just in James White's name, that's incredibly dangerous. What happens if he dies? Does his wife inherit it? Does it get sold off to pay his debts?
The church's assets were completely vulnerable.
They were, so they needed a legal corporation to hold property. They also needed a structure to, control the fanaticism we talked about earlier. And finally, they needed to ensure the mission would outlive the founders.
So reality just wore down the fear, bit by bit. And that brings us to the climax of this whole story, the years 1860 to 1863, the birth of the actual Seventh-day Adventist Church.
It all started with a name. In September 1860, they held a general meeting, and they finally agreed they needed a corporate identity.
And they chose Seventh-day Adventist.
A very practical choice. It described exactly who they were: people who kept the seventh-day Sabbath and were waiting for the Advent, the return of Christ.
And at that same meeting, they voted to form a legal association.
Yes, the Seventh-day Adventist Publishing Association. It was officially formed in May of 1861. And notice the pattern here. They organized the business first.
The publishing house. Because that's where the assets were.
That's where the assets were. But once the business side was settled, the church administration quickly followed. Later in 1861, the Michigan Conference was organized. That was the first state conference. They set up a chairman, a secretary, an advisory committee.
Michigan was the prototype.
Yeah.
And then they basically said, okay, every other state you do this, and then let's all get together.
And that's exactly what led to the big date, May 20th to 23rd, 1863.
The first general conference.
Delegates from 6 states gathered in Battle Creek. And they did the one thing that so many had feared for so long. They adopted a constitution.
9 articles.
9 articles. And what's remarkable is that the structure they set up then is largely the same structure the church uses today. It was a really robust system.
And they elected a president.
Yeah.
Now, you'd assume it would have to be James White. He was the one driving all of this.
He was. And he was nominated. But he declined.
Why would he do that?
Well, think about all that criticism we mentioned. He'd have been accused of being a power monger. If he had immediately taken the presidency, it would have looked like he was just validating his critics.
Ah, so it was a political move.
A very savvy one. So instead, a man named John Byington was elected as the first president.
It's grounding, I think, to look at the actual statistics from that meeting. I mean, we talk about this as the birth of a global church, but in 1863, what were we actually looking at?
It was so small, the source gives us the numbers. At the time of organization, there were 3,555 members.
3,500 people. That is smaller than a lot of high schools today.
Spread across 125 churches. And here's the stat that always gets me. There were only 22 ordained ministers.
22 ministers for 125 churches.
And 8 licensed workers. So a total paid workforce of 30 people.
That explains why the lay members were so critical. I mean, if you only see a pastor once every 2 months, the local people have to carry the load.
They absolutely had to. But because they had finally organized, because they had a system to pay those 22 guys and a headquarters to print literature, they could be incredibly effective. They could punch way above their weight class.
So let's zoom out and look at the whole journey. In 1853, you have this chaotic, frightened group plagued by imposters, meeting in living rooms, and just terrified of the word organization.
And by 1863, just 10 years later, they have a name. A legal headquarters, a publishing house, a financial system, a constitution, and a general conference.
It's a complete transformation, and it brings us back to that central fear of Babylon. Did it happen? Did organizing corrupt them?
That's the great irony, isn't it? The source material suggests the exact opposite happened. Structure didn't kill the movement, it saved it.
How so?
Well, without organization, they couldn't own property. Without property, they couldn't have a stable printing press. Without the press, they couldn't spread their message. Without salaries, the ministers would have been stuck farming corn instead of preaching.
So organization actually gave them the freedom to focus on the mission.
Precisely. Without this decade of organizing, without the ID cards, the tent, that 1% tax, the Constitution, the Advent movement, likely would have just dissolved. It would have splintered into a dozen little factions and faded into history like so many other 19th century religious groups.
That's a powerful lesson. Sometimes the thing you're most afraid of, rules, structure, administration, is the very thing you need to survive.
And that leads me to a final thought for you to consider. We often romanticize the wild early days of any movement or company. We love that chaotic energy. But think about this. If those early believers had stubbornly held on to their fear, if they had refused to organize in 1863 because they were terrified of becoming Babylon, would we even be here talking about them today?
That is a great question. Is organization the unsung hero of this story?
I think it just might be.
Well, that is all the time we have for this deep dive. From identity cards to constitutions, it has been a fascinating look at how a movement grows up. Thanks so much for joining us.
See you next time.